The confetti was still falling, the crowd still roaring, but Travis Kelce wasn't celebrating. He was holding back tears. As he stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembled, his voice unsteady. "This isn't about football," he finally said, and the stadium fell silent. No one expected what he was about to reveal, a truth that would shake millions watching. And when he finally spoke those next words, even his toughest teammates couldn't hold back their emotions. The air was thick with celebration, yet Travis Kelce felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle in his chest. His teammates shouted, clapped, and embraced, their joy electrifying the field, but he remained still, his fingers tightening around the microphone as if anchoring himself. The confetti swirled around him, bright and chaotic, but it blurred in his vision. His heart pounded, not from the adrenaline of victory, but from the weight of the words he was about to speak. He cleared his throat, but no words came out at first. The stadium noise was deafening, yet in his mind there was only silence. The kind that had followed him for weeks. The kind that had made even the biggest moments feel hollow. His fingers curled slightly, gripping the mic harder as he exhaled slowly. Patrick Mahomes glanced at him from a few feet away, eyebrows slightly furrowed. "You good, bro?" he murmured, just loud enough for Travis to hear over the noise. Kelce didn't answer right away. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he nodded once. But was he? Could he even say what was on his mind without breaking apart in front of thousands in the stadium, millions watching at home? The crowd was waiting. The world was waiting. He lifted the mic closer and, in a voice steadier than he expected, he finally spoke. This isn't about football." The words sent a hush through the stadium. The sea of reporters lowered their cameras just slightly, as if sensing something different, something unscripted. Teammates who had been caught in their own celebrations turned to look at him. The energy shifted, as if time itself had slowed, waiting for him to continue. Kelce blinked up at the sky for a second, gathering himself, before looking back at the sea of expectant faces. "Tonight isn't just about winning," he said, his voice raw, almost hesitant. "It's about a promise I made to someone who isn't here anymore." The crowd didn't react right away. There was confusion, anticipation, and something else, an unfamiliar silence that settled over tens of thousands of people, all waiting for his next words. His throat burned. His hands, usually so sure on the field, trembled slightly as he pulled something small from his pocket, a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it with care, smoothing out the creases as his eyes lingered on the inked words he had read 100 times before, but could barely bring himself to say out loud. He inhaled sharply, blinking against the bright lights. "This is for someone who believed in me more than anyone ever did," he murmured. Then, just before he began reading, his voice dropped to barely a whisper, though in the silent stadium it carried louder than any roar. "And I hope he's watching." The memory of that day clung to Travis Kelce like a shadow, even in this moment of triumph. The cheers, the flashing lights, the overwhelming energy of a Super Bowl victory, none of it could drown out the quiet voice that echoed in his mind. Ethan's voice. The boy who had sat across from him months ago, eyes gleaming with a passion so pure, it had reminded Travis of why he loved this game in the first place. He could still see him, sitting at the edge of his hospital bed, fingers absent-mindedly tracing the Chiefs logo on his blanket. His body frail, but his spirit unshaken. They had talked for hours about football, about life, about how the game made everything else feel small for a while. Ethan had laughed when Travis told him about his pre-game superstitions, shaking his head and saying, "You really think wearing the same socks every game is helping you win?" Travis had grinned back then, ruffling the kid's hair. "Hey, don't mess with the routine. It's working, isn't it?" Ethan had smiled, but there had been something in his eyes, something unspoken. And just before Travis left that day, Ethan had reached for his wrist, gripping it tighter than his small hands should have been able to. "Promise me you'll make it to the Super Bowl this year. I want to see you win." That moment had stayed with him, burned into his mind as clearly as any touchdown play he had ever run. He had promised. He had meant it. And yet, a few weeks before the playoffs, the call had come. A quiet, shaky voice on the other end. Ethan's mother. "He fought hard, Travis, but he's gone." The words had hit harder than any tackle. Travis had sat there, gripping his phone, staring at the floor as the noise around him blurred into nothing. He had wanted to say something, anything, but no words had felt right. Now, standing here, trophy in hand, confetti swirling at his feet, he felt the weight of that promise more than ever. This win wasn't just for the team. It wasn't just for the fans. It was for Ethan, for the dream he never got to see come true. Travis swallowed hard, his fingers brushing against his pocket. Inside, crumpled but safely kept, was the last letter Ethan had written to him, the letter that had arrived just days before the Super Bowl, the one he hadn't been able to bring himself to read until now. The roar of the stadium felt distant, almost muted, as Travis Kelce stood on the field, his chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. Sweat clung to his skin, despite the cool night air, and the scent of turf mixed with the sharp bite of adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The game had been brutal, every second a battle. But now that it was over, now that they had won, it didn't feel the way he had imagined. He had pictured this moment before, countless times, the celebration, the euphoria, the undeniable proof that they were the best. But instead of pure elation, there was a tightness in his throat, a weight in his heart that no victory could shake. He had done it. They had done it. And yet, the one person he wanted to see in the crowd, the one face he had promised he would make proud, wasn't there. His mind flashed back to the game, to the moments when exhaustion clawed at his limbs, when doubt threatened to creep in. Every time he had faltered, he had heard Ethan's voice in his head. "You got this, Kelce. One more play." It had pushed him forward, kept him standing when his body begged to fall. Even as defenders closed in, even as the pressure mounted, that small voice had been louder than the crowd, louder than the fear of failure. Now, standing beneath the blinding lights, he reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled edges of the letter Ethan had written him. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the creases, knowing the words inside had been written with a belief so strong it had outlived the boy himself. Someone clapped him on the back, a teammate shouting in celebration, but he barely registered it. His vision blurred for a second, the noise swelling around him, but all he could focus on was the promise he had made. The one he had just kept, the one that suddenly felt bigger than the game, bigger than the trophy, bigger than himself. This win wasn't just for him. It was for Ethan. And in that moment, he knew. Ethan had never really left. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the letter, the thin paper crinkling softly in the cold night air. The stadium, once deafening with celebration, had fallen into an eerie silence. The weight of what he was about to say pressed against his chest, heavier than any tackle he had ever taken. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant echoes of cheers still rippling through the crowd. He swallowed hard, steadying himself. This moment wasn't about football anymore. It wasn't about the trophy gleaming under the bright lights. It was about something far greater. He took a slow breath and began reading, his voice quieter than usual. Yet it carried through the hushed stadium, as if the world had paused just to listen. If you win, tell the world that no dream is too big. Even if we don't get to see it, we still believe in it. The words felt like a whisper from the past, reaching out, unshaken by time. His grip on the letter tightened. A lump formed in his throat, and for a second, he couldn't speak. His eyes darted across the sea of faces in front of him, thousands of people waiting, watching, hanging on to every breath he took. He exhaled shakily, blinking against the sting in his eyes. This letter, these words, they weren't just ink on paper. They were a promise, a dream left unfinished. I met someone last year, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. A kid who loved this game more than anything, who fought harder than I ever have, who believed in something bigger than football. His fingers curled around the edges of the letter, as if holding on to a piece of Ethan himself. He told me to win, and when I promised him I would, I thought he'd be here to see it. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Reporters shifted uncomfortably, their cameras still fixed on him, yet even they seemed momentarily lost in the weight of his words. A few teammates bowed their heads, swallowing back their own emotions. Kelce's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. I kept my promise, he said, his eyes lifting toward the sky. And I know he kept his. For a moment, the world stood still. Then, as if on cue, the stadium erupted. Not in deafening cheers, but in something deeper. A collective understanding, an unspoken unity in grief, in triumph, in the undeniable power of a promise kept. As Travis stepped back from the microphone, a heavy silence hung in the air before giving way to something more powerful than the loudest cheer. The crowd wasn't roaring in victory anymore. Instead, they stood frozen, absorbing the weight of his words. Some wiped away tears, others clapped slowly, reverently, as if unsure how to respond to a moment so raw, so deeply human. The energy in the stadium had shifted, not just for those in attendance but for the millions watching from their homes, their screens flickering with the image of a man who had just turned a Super Bowl celebration into something infinitely greater. The clip of his speech spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media was flooded with messages from fans, from athletes, from strangers who had never watched a football game in their life, but now felt connected to something bigger. News headlines didn't just highlight the game. They focused on the story, on the name that now echoed across the world. Ethan. His dream, his belief, his words. They had outlived him. And then, something unexpected happened. Donations to children's hospitals surged overnight. People reaching into their pockets, not just to support a cause, but to honor a boy they had never met. Parents sat their kids down, telling them about the power of keeping promises, about how belief in something, even if you never get to see it, can change the world. In the days that followed, Travis received letters, messages from families, from kids battling their own fights, telling him that Ethan's story had given them hope. And in that, he knew. This wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. The game, the trophy, the win, they were just footnotes in a legacy that would live far beyond the stadium lights. Ethan had never made it to the Super Bowl, but now, in a way no one could have imagined, his dream had reached further than he ever thought possible. If this story moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who believes in the power of promises. Subscribe now for more inspiring stories that remind us why some moments are bigger than the game.